In March 1991, 2-year-old Thomas Gibson vanished from his front yard in rural Oregon while his father, a sheriff's deputy, was out for a jog. Search teams combed the fields, the rivers, and the neighboring woods. No footprints, no fibers, no blood, nothing. The answer would take years to surface. How could a child vanish from a yard no bigger than a living room on a quiet morning under the watch of a man trained to find the missing? Azalea, Oregon, sits quietly in the hills of Douglas County, a town that once lived by logging and learned to live without it. In March 1991, on March 18, 1991, the Gibson family woke to one of those ordinary mornings that never announce what they're about to take. Their house stood at the end of a gravel road, a single-story home with a small fenced yard and a swing that tilted a little to one side. Larry Gibson, 34, was a deputy sheriff with Douglas County, known in town as steady, clean-cut, a man who could be trusted. That morning, Judith cleaned the kitchen while the children played in and out of the living room. Larry had the day off and planned to go for a run before lunch. He said he needed the air, and Judith nodded without looking up from the sink. It was their rhythm. He ran. She kept the house moving. The children found their corners to fill. The television played faintly in another room. Somewhere outside, the creek that ran behind the property murmured over stones. Tommy was already in the front yard when Larry came out to tie his shoes. The yard wasn't large, barely 20 feet deep before it met the fence. But to a toddler, it was a whole country. The grass was still wet from the morning dew, and the boy's shoes made soft prints where he moved his toy truck in slow, deliberate lines. Larry leaned against the porch railing, watching for a moment. Judith called from inside that Karen would be out soon. Larry said he'd only be gone for a short run. A couple of miles, no more. He carried his service pistol in a holster at his hip. Deputies in Douglas County often did, even off-duty. It was habit more than caution, part of the uniform that stayed with them. He checked the latch on the gate, told his son to wait for his sister, and jogged down the drive. The boy lifted his head, waved a hand still clumsy with baby fat, and said something that sounded like, "Bye-bye, Daddy." The road from the Gibson house wound past open fields, then turned toward a stand of pines. Larry settled into a steady pace, the kind that kept his mind empty. Half a mile down, he saw a flicker of movement near the ditch, a gray cat he recognized from the neighbor's property. The same cat that had been tearing through his trash cans for weeks. He'd complained about it more than once, even called the Humane Society, but no one came that far out to collect strays. Out here, people handled their own problems. Larry slowed, drew his .45 caliber Colt from its holster, and fired once toward the ditch. The shot cracked through the still air, scattering a handful of crows from a nearby fence post. He waited a second, saw nothing move, and holstered the weapon again. It was the kind of act that hardly registered. A small irritation answered and forgotten before his next breath. He kept jogging. The run took longer than planned. The road dipped into low ground, then rose toward the ridge where the forest thickened. The air smelled of pine pitch and wet bark. He turned back after what he thought was 2 miles. By the time he reached his driveway again, his watch read 12:15. Judith was on the porch, shading her eyes against the light. Her voice carried sharp across the yard. "Larry, is he with you?" He stopped short. "Who?" "Tommy. He's gone. I can't find him." At first he thought she was joking, or mistaken. The front yard looked exactly as it had when he'd left. The swing still, the toy truck tipped on its side, the gate open an inch wider than before. He called his son's name, then louder. Nothing. He checked behind the porch steps, the shed, the space between the fence and the old woodpile. Judith ran along the ditch, peering into the brush. They circled the house twice, calling until their voices went hoarse. When the search turned up nothing, Larry took the patrol car and drove up the road, horn blaring. He stopped at the first intersection, called out, reversed, and came back. Judith was still by the porch, crying now, her hands shaking. At 12:55, they called the sheriff's department. The dispatcher's voice was calm, steady. 2-year-old male, last seen in front yard. Blonde hair, blue eyes, no known medical issues. By 1:30, patrol units had arrived. A volunteer firefighter from Azalea pulled his truck into the drive. Others followed, neighbors, church friends, people from Larry's own scout troop. Within an hour, the yard and the road beyond it were lined with vehicles. The sheriff's office set up a makeshift command post near the mailbox. Search dogs were brought in first. Their handlers led them in slow circles through the yard, then down the road. The dogs caught a scent at the gate, followed it 50 yards, then lost it at the curve. Helicopters swept overhead, their blades kicking dust into the air. Men waded through the creek, combed the tall grass by the fence, checked under porches and sheds. The hours bled together. Judith moved mechanically, answering questions, pointing to the last place she'd seen her son. Larry walked the perimeter again and again, his face expressionless. When asked how long he'd been gone, he said about 45 minutes. The deputies wrote it down, nodding without comment. By 4 in the afternoon, the search grid stretched nearly 2 miles in every direction. Neighbors checked their barns and sheds. Volunteer firefighters marked each cleared patch with bright orange tape. Nothing turned up. Not a shoe, not a footprint, not a broken twig. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, the temperature dropped. Coffee was passed around in paper cups. Someone offered to drive Judith into town to rest, but she refused to leave the house. "He'll come back here," she said. "He always comes back." Larry went inside briefly and returned in uniform. He said it felt right, like he needed to look official. Judith didn't answer. Outside, the search continued in widening circles, each one coming back empty. By 6 o'clock, the sheriff himself called the search to a pause. "We'll start again at first light," he said quietly. "We're not done." The volunteers nodded, tired and pale in the fading light. One of them picked up the yellow toy truck from the grass and set it on the porch railing, as if to keep it safe. When the last of the vehicles pulled away, the sound of their engines faded into the hills, leaving only the whisper of wind through the trees. Judith stood on the porch, arms crossed tight against the cold. Larry stayed beside her, scanning the darkening yard as though the child might simply step back into it. The house behind them glowed dimly through the windows. Inside, the kitchen table was still set for lunch, the sandwiches untouched. The swing in the yard moved once in the wind, creaking softly. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The world had narrowed to the patch of grass where their son had last stood, and the silence around it. The search maps lay folded on the hood of a patrol car, lines of red ink circling a center that had given nothing back. The search for Thomas Gibson did not end with the setting sun. At first light on March 19, 1991, a fresh grid was drawn across the wooded hills around Azalea. Deputies from neighboring towns joined in, along with off-duty officers and volunteers from the Mormon Church. Among the first to arrive was Larry's own Boy Scout troop, teenagers in green shirts and kerchiefs, carrying flashlights and walkie-talkies. They moved through the brush in straight lines, calling the boy's name as if a louder voice might bring him back. By mid-morning, nearly 100 people were in motion. Helicopters swept low over Swamp Creek, and deputies on horseback searched the far banks. The temperature dropped as fog settled along the ridges, and every shout seemed to fade into it. Larry moved among them, calm and methodical, giving orders when asked. He carried a clipboard, noted search zones, checked the maps. Those who knew him said he looked like a man doing his job. Those who didn't found the composure strange. Judith stayed by the house, refusing to rest. Each time a vehicle slowed near the driveway, she looked up, hoping it was someone bringing news. None came. By noon, the sheriff told her they were expanding the perimeter another mile in every direction. Larry nodded in agreement, then went inside to change. When he came out again, he was freshly shaved, dressed in his tan deputy's uniform, badge polished, sidearm, holstered. It was something no one had seen before in a parent of a missing child. Deputies whispered about it quietly that afternoon. One of them later wrote in his report, "Gibson appeared unusually composed, maintains control but lacks affect, states he needs to look professional for the media." The press arrived in full by the second day. A news crew from Portland filmed the command post set up beside the Gibson home. Larry stood in front of the cameras, answering questions in short, clipped sentences. "We're doing everything we can," he said. "Every minute counts." His voice was steady, his face expressionless. Judith stood beside him, pale and silent. In the days that followed, the search grew outward like a spill of ink. Fields, creeks, and roads were combed again and again. Deputies marked off abandoned sheds, empty wells, and drainage ditches. Teams of volunteers searched the forest by lantern light long after midnight. They found footprints, but none small enough to belong to a 2-year-old. The toy truck left in the yard was the only physical trace of Thomas Gibson anyone ever recovered. The sheriff's office began reconstructing the timeline. Larry said he had left home at 11:30 a.m. for his jog. The route, roughly 2 miles round trip, should have taken 20 minutes. He returned, he said, around 12:15. Judith placed the moment she realized her son was missing closer to 12:30. The call to dispatch was logged at 12:55. That left nearly half an hour no one could account for. Then there was the car. Larry had driven his patrol vehicle that morning, a white sheriff's sedan with the department insignia on the door. Deputies noted that it was unusual for him to use it while off duty. The odometer showed an additional 7 miles that weren't on record. When questioned, Larry explained that after searching the yard, he had driven to a nearby rest area to check whether the child had wandered that far. The sheriff accepted the answer for the moment, but made a note of it. A second inconsistency emerged a few days later. Larry admitted firing his service weapon that morning, saying he had taken a shot at a stray cat before his run and missed. When investigators returned to the area, they found a dead cat near the tree line, about 50 yards from the road. 2 bullets had entered through the skull and chest. Ballistic tests matched both rounds to Larry's pistol. It was an odd detail, one detective later recalled. People miss, people lie, but rarely both in the same story. By the end of March, the organized search was scaled back. The helicopters were grounded, and the volunteers went home. A smaller investigative team took over, reviewing statements, collecting lab results, checking leads. A dozen possible sightings came in through the tip line. A boy at a rest stop, another in a grocery store parking lot, but each was dismissed within hours. Then came a statement from 4-year-old Karen Gibson. During an interview with 2 detectives, she said she had seen a truck pull into the driveway while her father was out jogging. Inside, she said, were a blonde woman and a dark-haired man. "They took Tommy," she said quietly. They drove away. Detectives asked her to describe the vehicle. She said it was yellow or brownish. They asked if she knew the people. She shook her head. She said they didn't talk. The statement was carefully written down, though no one could verify it. There were no tire tracks on the gravel road, no neighbors who reported seeing a truck that day. Still, the description was released to the public. Tan or gold pickup truck, possibly older model, 2 occupants. For weeks, that image was everywhere, on posters, in newscasts, in the minds of people driving down Oregon highways looking into the rearview mirror. No such vehicle was ever found. Inside the department, doubts began to circle. Officers who had worked alongside Larry for years said he seemed distant, detached, sometimes irritated when questioned. He rarely spoke about the child directly. When he did, his voice stayed flat. The sheriff held a private meeting with senior staff in April. Officially, the case remained a missing child investigation. Unofficially, they began to wonder whether something else had happened. The issue was delicate. Larry was one of their own, a deputy with 12 years on the force, a father, a man whose house they had searched and whose wife they had comforted. But the facts refused to sit still. The route that should have taken 20 minutes had taken nearly 50. The shot that was supposed to miss had struck. The car that should have been parked had moved 7 miles. And through it all, Larry's composure never cracked. The media attention waned by summer. Reporters moved on to other stories, and Azalea went back to its quiet pace. The Gibson house, once crowded with search teams, looked untouched again. Judith stopped giving interviews. She attended church less often, spending most of her time at home with Karen. Larry returned to work in June, but was kept on limited duty. He filed routine paperwork, drove patrol only occasionally. Inside the department, whispers followed him like a shadow. One deputy recalled walking into the locker room and finding him staring at his own reflection for a long time. When asked how he was holding up, Larry had said, "You just keep doing what you know how to do." In July, the sheriff placed him on administrative leave, pending further review. The department cited the need for rest and distance. Larry accepted without protest. The investigation continued into the fall. Detectives re-interviewed neighbors, reviewed call logs, compared statements again. Nothing changed. No one had seen a truck. No one had heard a struggle. The yard where Tommy played showed no disturbance, no footprints but his own. The Oregon State Police lab confirmed the ballistics findings. The same. 2 bullets, the same weapon. But without evidence linking the shots to the child's disappearance, it was meaningless on paper. Judith, interviewed again in September, described her husband as quiet, tired, trying not to think. She said she believed the story about the truck, believed someone had taken her son. But when asked if she trusted Larry's version of events completely, she hesitated before answering. "I think he tells what he can live with," she said. By winter, the case had slowed to a crawl. The sheriff's office filed its last progress report in December 1991. The opening line read simply, "Investigation ongoing, subject missing, no further developments." Larry spent the holidays at home. Karen asked again where her brother was. Judith told her that Tommy was with Angels, then corrected herself, saying they were still looking. Larry said nothing. In early 1992, he submitted his resignation. The letter was short, typed on department stationery. "For personal and family reasons, I am unable to continue my duties at this time. Respectfully, Deputy Larry D. Gibson." The sheriff accepted it without comment. When he left the office for the last time, a few colleagues stood by the door. No one knew whether to shake his hand. He nodded once, said, "Take care," and walked out. The patrol car he turned in still smelled faintly of disinfectant. The odometer read 58,307 miles. After Larry Gibson resigned from the Douglas County Sheriff's Department in early 1992, the family left Oregon quietly. There were no announcements in the paper, no farewells from the department. One spring morning, their furniture was loaded into a rented truck, and by the following week, the house on the gravel road stood empty. They moved 900 miles northeast to a small town near Helena, Montana, a place where no one knew their faces, and where a man could start again without being asked too many questions. Larry told neighbors he'd left law enforcement to focus on family and took a job selling insurance. He shaved his mustache, traded his deputy's uniform for pressed shirts and ties, and learned to talk about coverage plans instead of search grids. At first, the new town welcomed them. The local Mormon congregation, hearing that the Gibsons had transferred from Oregon, helped them find a rental house on a quiet street. Larry joined the men's group on weekends, bringing donuts and shaking hands firmly. Judith brought the girls to church activities, polite and reserved. People said she seemed tired but kind, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. For a few months, they passed as ordinary. Larry kept a steady job, paid bills on time, volunteered for local scout events again. Judith stayed home, expecting another child. She gave birth to a daughter, Lisa, that summer, a dark-haired baby who slept easily and rarely cried. For a while, it seemed like they had managed to build something new out of what had been shattered. But under the surface, the silence grew thicker. Larry didn't talk about Oregon. When neighbors asked why they'd moved, he said only that it was a hard time. At home, he avoided the subject altogether. He kept to a routine: work, church, dinner, television. He spoke little to Judith, less to Karen. When the subject of Tommy surfaced, he would leave the room. Judith tried to be patient, but she felt the distance hardening. The weight of that unspoken absence lingered in every corner of the house. Tommy's name was never banned, yet never said aloud. When Judith prayed at night, she sometimes whispered his name under her breath, afraid Larry might hear. Karen, now 5, didn't understand the rules of silence. She still remembered her brother's face, the toy truck, the sound of his laughter in the yard. Sometimes she asked where he was. Other times she woke up crying, insisting that she'd seen him in her dreams. "Daddy hurt Tommy," she mumbled once, half asleep, twisting in her blankets. Judith froze. It was the kind of sentence that hung in the air long after it was spoken, fragile but impossible to ignore. She asked Karen what she meant, but the child said nothing more. In the morning, she didn't seem to remember. At church, the Gibsons' story traveled in whispers. People knew something had happened back in Oregon, a missing child, a family tragedy, a man leaving the force, but the details were cloudy. The community offered sympathy at first: casseroles, visits, invitations to dinner. Then came distance. Conversation slowed when Larry entered a room. The warmth turned polite, then cool. One Sunday, after service, the bishop asked Larry if he planned to reapply for police work. Larry shook his head. "That part of my life's over," he said. He didn't mention that the Oregon State Police had kept his file open, or that the sheriff who once worked beside him now avoided his calls. Judith felt the isolation more deeply than he did. She missed her friends in Oregon, missed the few people who still asked about Tommy. In Montana, no one did. She tried to make new connections: mothers at church, neighbors, other young families. But the conversations always stayed on the surface. It was hard to build friendships around a story you couldn't tell. As months passed, the marriage began to fray. Larry withdrew further into routine, often spending evenings at the office or driving without explaining where. Judith grew suspicious but said nothing. Their arguments, when they came, were quiet and cutting. "You don't talk to me," she said once at the dinner table. "I talk when there's something to say," he replied. After that, she stopped asking. Karen's nightmares became more frequent that winter. She would wake up screaming, saying she saw Tommy crying by the porch or lying on the ground. Judith sat with her until she fell asleep again, brushing her hair and whispering that everything was fine. But when Karen was asleep, Judith stayed awake, staring at the dark. She began to wonder if the child was remembering something, not dreaming it. One afternoon, while cleaning Karen's room, Judith found a crayon drawing tucked under the pillow. It showed 4 stick figures, a man, a woman, a small girl, and another figure drawn in faint gray, lying near the corner of the page. Above them was a yellow sun, smiling as children's suns do. Judith folded the drawing and put it in her dresser. She never mentioned it to Larry. By early 1993, the distance between them had become impossible to ignore. Larry had started sleeping on the couch, claiming the baby's crying kept him awake. Judith didn't argue. She began making plans quietly, saving money from groceries, writing letters to her mother in Oregon. When she told Larry she wanted to go back home for a while, he didn't protest. "Do what you need to do," he said. It was the closest he had come to permission in months. In March, Judith packed the car with clothes, toys, and the baby's things. Karen sat in the back seat, clutching a stuffed animal. Larry stood in the driveway, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. "Take care of yourself," he said. Judith looked at him for a long moment, searching for something that wasn't there anymore. Then she started the car and drove away. The road back to Oregon wound through the same ranges they'd once crossed together. Snow clung to the mountain shoulders, and the radio faded in and out. Karen slept most of the way, her head resting against the window. When they stopped for gas near Spokane, Judith looked in the rearview mirror and saw her own face, pale, older, like someone who had waited too long to move. They reached Oregon after 2 days. Judith stayed with her mother in Eugene, sharing a small room with the girls. It wasn't much, but it felt safer. She found part-time work at a laundromat and began rebuilding quietly, piece by piece. Every now and then, she thought about calling the sheriff's office to ask for updates, but she never did. It had been 2 years since Tommy vanished, and the thought of hearing the same rehearsed answer, "No new developments," felt heavier than silence. Larry, back in Montana, lived alone now. He kept the house clean, drove to work, attended church less frequently. Neighbors said he was polite but distant, a man who seemed half present. He stopped mentioning his family altogether. In the evenings, he sat by the window, watching cars pass on the road below. The television played quietly in the background. Local news, sports, the hum of other people's lives. No one in town asked about the missing child from Oregon, and he never offered the story. Sometimes, late at night, he opened a small box he kept in a drawer. Inside were photographs, Tommy on his 2nd birthday, Karen with her first school ribbon, Judith smiling faintly at a picnic. He looked at them for a few minutes, then closed the box again. He had started attending church alone. When the congregation sang hymns about redemption, he stood silent, eyes fixed on the page. Afterward, he would shake hands with the bishop and leave without staying for coffee. By autumn, few people in Montana remembered that the Gibsons had come there as a family. Most knew Larry only as the quiet insurance agent who kept to himself. He rarely mentioned Oregon, and when he did, it was with the tone of someone speaking about a dream half remembered. Back in Oregon, Judith began to notice Karen's drawings again. More careful, less dark, but always with one missing figure. When asked, Karen said she didn't know why she drew that way. "It just feels right," she said. Judith understood. There are absences that take shape even in a child's hands. The file on Tommy Gibson sat untouched in the Douglas County evidence room, dust settling on its edge. But something was still moving, quietly, beneath all that silence, not in the records or the reports, but in the half-formed memories of a little girl who couldn't sleep through the night. 3 years after Thomas Gibson vanished, the silence finally cracked. Not through evidence, not through new witnesses, but through the small, uncertain voice of a 7-year-old girl. It began early that year, in February 1994, inside a small rental house in Eugene, Oregon. Karen Gibson had grown quieter with age, a cautious child with watchful eyes, who spoke carefully and never raised her voice. But that winter, she began to wake again in the middle of the night, crying for her brother. The nightmares had returned, sharper now, more vivid. Judith would find her sitting up in bed, trembling, saying she'd seen Tommy outside, that she could hear Daddy yelling. At first, Judith tried to soothe her with the same reassurances she'd offered for years. "It was a dream, honey. Daddy didn't mean to scare you." But the sentences didn't calm her anymore. The next morning, Judith noticed Karen had drawn another picture. This one showed a man in a brown uniform standing over a smaller figure on the ground. Above them, a car with flashing lights. She tucked the drawing away but couldn't shake the unease. A week later, during a counseling session arranged through her elementary school, Karen began to talk. The counselor, a soft-spoken woman named Ellen Wright, asked gentle questions about home, about family, about what Karen remembered of Oregon before Montana. The child hesitated, then whispered something that made Ellen stop writing. That afternoon, Ellen called Judith to the office. Karen sat beside her mother, clutching a stuffed animal. Her words came out haltingly, pieced together from memory fragments. "Tommy followed Daddy outside," she said. "Daddy was mad. He told Tommy to stop. He hit him." She made a quick motion with her hand, an imitation of a strike, then quieter. "He put him in the car, the one with the lights." Judith stared at her daughter, unsure what she was hearing. "Are you sure?" she asked. Karen nodded. "He told me not to tell. He said he'd put me in the hole too." The room went still. Ellen Wright documented the statement and, following mandatory reporting laws, contacted the Eugene Police Department. Within 24 hours, the file was transferred to Douglas County, and the case of Thomas Gibson, missing since March 18, 1991, was reopened. Detectives arrived at Judith's home 2 days later. They listened carefully as she recounted the timeline of events, her relocation to Montana, the deterioration of the marriage, and her decision to return to Oregon. They asked about Larry's behavior, about his temper, about anything unusual she might have noticed. Judith hesitated, then admitted what she had long ignored. There had been moments, small, isolated at first, where Larry's control had slipped. Once he'd thrown a chair when Karen spilled juice. Another time, he'd shouted so loudly the baby started screaming. She had told herself it was stress, grief, exhaustion. Now she wasn't sure. The detectives recorded everything, thanking her for her honesty. When they left, one of them said quietly, "We'll need to talk to him." Back in Montana, Larry Gibson was still living in the same modest house on Cedar Street. To his neighbors, he was polite but detached, the man who waved but rarely lingered. He worked as an insurance agent for a regional company, attended church occasionally, and kept mostly to himself. On April 14, 1994, 2 plainclothes officers from Oregon knocked on his door. They had a warrant for second-degree murder. Larry didn't resist. He opened the door, stepped aside, and let them in. "I figured this would come," he said evenly. Inside the house, everything was tidy. The curtains were drawn, the sink clean. A framed photograph of Tommy sat on a shelf, the boy smiling beneath a paper birthday hat. The officers read Larry his rights, cuffed him gently, and led him to the car. As they passed the neighbors' lawns, a woman watering her garden paused to stare. Larry met her eyes briefly and nodded. He was extradited to Oregon within the week. When news of his arrest reached Eugene, Judith felt both vindicated and terrified. The past she had tried to outrun was now at her doorstep again. She agreed to cooperate fully with investigators, providing every document and letter she still had from their marriage. She also reached out to Larry's half-sister, Debbie Kallick, who lived in Iowa. Debbie had stayed close to Judith after the separation, though contact with Larry had ended years earlier. On the phone, when Judith told her about the new investigation, Debbie went silent for several seconds. Then she said quietly, "I think I need to tell you something." A few days later, she gave her statement to police. She described a late-night phone call she had received from Larry in the spring of 1991, weeks after Tommy's disappearance. His voice, she said, was frantic, uneven. He said, "I think I killed him." Those were his words. I asked what he meant, but he wouldn't explain. He just said it was an accident, that it all happened too fast. Then he hung up. Debbie had never gone to the police. At the time, she said, she thought Larry was having a breakdown. She regretted it now. Her testimony, combined with Karen's recollection, gave the investigators what they needed: probable cause. The reopening of the case made headlines across Oregon. The story of the missing toddler had long been buried in small-town memory, but now the name Deputy Larry Gibson was back in print. The press described him as a former lawman accused of turning suspect, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone. Detectives re-examined every piece of evidence. They returned to the Gibson property in Azalea, now occupied by another family. They searched the creek again, the old woodpile, the fields beyond the fence. They dug through archived reports and found the notes from the 1991 inconsistencies: his jogging time, the odometer readings, the ballistics on the dead cat. The patterns that had once seemed like coincidences now looked like clues. Meanwhile, Larry sat in a county holding cell, calm as ever. Reporters waiting outside the courthouse shouted questions, but he never spoke. Through his attorney, he issued only one statement: "I am innocent of these accusations. I have no idea what happened to my son." The district attorney held a press conference, confirming the arrest and the charge of second-degree murder. He spoke of new witness statements and significant corroboration of prior inconsistencies. He didn't mention the child by name, but everyone knew. Judith stayed home that night. The television turned off. Karen played with her dolls quietly, unaware of the storm that was forming around her own testimony. As the case moved toward trial, more pieces surfaced. Old colleagues from the sheriff's department were interviewed again. Some admitted that even back in 1991, they'd had doubts about Larry's account. "We wanted to believe him," one said. "He was one of us." But the story never fit right. A few officers recalled seeing him the morning after Tommy vanished. Calm, clean-shaven, back in uniform. One deputy remembered asking him if he wanted to take leave. "No point sitting around," Larry had replied. The prosecutors built a narrative: a moment of anger, a fatal mistake, a cover-up disguised as grief. They didn't claim premeditation, only control and concealment. By the end of April 1994, the evidence had been presented to a grand jury. The indictment came quickly. State of Oregon versus Larry Dean Gibson, second-degree murder in connection with the death of Thomas Dean Gibson, age 2. When the story broke on the evening news, the image they used was an old one: Larry in his deputy's uniform, hand resting on the shoulder of a smiling boy with a toy truck. Underneath, the caption read, "Father charged in son's disappearance." Neighbors in Montana watched in disbelief. To them, he had been quiet, polite, the man who shoveled his driveway before dawn. In Azalea, the reaction was mixed: sadness, anger, relief. The case that had haunted the town for 3 years had suddenly come alive again. Judith avoided reporters, refusing every request for comment. She told a friend, "I don't feel vindicated, I just feel empty." Karen, too young to grasp the scale of what she'd set in motion, asked why people were saying bad things about Daddy. Judith told her the truth would come out in time. When the detectives escorted Larry into the courthouse for arraignment, he kept his head high, eyes forward. The photographers shouted his name, flashes cutting through the air. One reporter asked if he had anything to say to his wife. He didn't respond. Inside the courtroom, he stood as the charges were read. The words, "Murder in the second degree," echoed off the walls. He showed no reaction. His attorney entered a plea of not guilty. As he was led away, someone in the back of the courtroom whispered, "That's the deputy who lost his kid." Another voice replied, "That's the one who killed him." Judith didn't attend the hearing. Instead, she sat at home with the girls, the blinds drawn, the phone off the hook. For the first time in years, she felt something like clarity. Terrible, sharp, and undeniable. The silence that had ruled their lives was over. Outside, spring light flickered across the yard, catching the edge of the toy box by the window. Inside, Karen sat cross-legged on the floor, humming to herself, tracing shapes on the carpet with her finger. Judith watched her daughter for a long time and thought of all the years she had spent pretending not to know what she already felt. The trial of Larry Dean Gibson opened on a cold January morning in 1995, nearly 4 years after his son had disappeared. Snow still lined the curbs outside the Douglas County Courthouse, and the air inside the old building smelled of paper, dust, and anticipation. The courtroom filled early. Reporters from Portland, a few national outlets, neighbors from Azalea who had driven north to watch, and law enforcement officers who once worked beside the man now seated at the defense table. Larry sat quietly, shoulders squared, hands folded before him. His face was drawn, older than his 40 years, but calm. The badge he once wore had long been turned in. His suit hung too loose at the collar. Judith Gibson was there too, sitting near the back beside her sister. She held a tissue in her hands, but didn't use it. Karen was not in the room yet, though her name was on everyone's lips. The prosecution called the case State of Oregon versus Larry Dean Gibson. The charge, second-degree murder in the death of Thomas Dean Gibson, age 2. From the outset, the prosecution built its story as carefully as a blueprint. District Attorney Michael Warner spoke slowly, methodically, laying out the narrative piece by piece. "This is a case about a moment of anger," he began. "A moment that ended a life, and 3 years of silence that followed it." According to the state's theory, the morning of March 18, 1991, had begun normally. Larry went for a jog, took his gun with him, and shot a stray cat near the edge of the property. The bullet found its mark. Tommy, curious and unsteady on his feet, followed the sound. When the child approached the cat's body, Larry lost his temper, angry at the interruption, at the mess, at himself, and struck the boy. The blow was too hard. Tommy fell, hit his head, and went still. What happened next, Warner said, was the act that turned a tragedy into a crime. Instead of calling for help, he told the jury, Larry Gibson, a deputy sheriff, used his training not to save a life, but to hide what he had done. The prosecution argued that Larry carried the child's body to his patrol car, placed him in a plastic bag, and drove to a remote spot during the chaos of the search. There, he disposed of the remains before returning to the scene, showered, shaved, and dressed in uniform, ready to join the search for the child he knew could not be found. It was a story built from fragments, testimony, timelines, and memories pulled from a frightened child's mind. But it was enough for a trial. Karen Gibson was called to the stand on the third day. At 7 years old, she looked impossibly small in the witness chair, legs swinging above the floor, voice barely rising above a whisper. The courtroom went still as she adjusted the microphone. The judge leaned forward, gentle, reminding her to take her time. She told the story carefully, as though each word might break. She said that she remembered that day, the sun, the yard, the cat near the road. She remembered Tommy following their father and how Daddy had yelled at him. "He got mad," she said. "He hit Tommy and carried him to the car, then he drove away." "Did your father say anything to you after that?" the prosecutor asked. Karen hesitated, then nodded. "He told me not to tell," she said. "He said he'd put me in the hole too." There was a murmur in the courtroom. The judge called for silence. Karen's voice never rose, never cracked. She spoke the way children do when they've learned that quiet is safer than noise. When she stepped down, she glanced once toward her mother. Judith gave her a small, trembling nod. The defense began its work immediately after. Attorney John Callahan, appointed to represent Larry, stood and thanked the girl for her honesty before turning to the jury. "Memory," he said, "is not a perfect instrument, especially not when it belongs to a child who has lived through fear, separation, and suggestion." Callahan's strategy was built on skepticism. He argued that Karen's recollection had been shaped over years of exposure to questions, therapy, and her mother's grief. "She believes she remembers," he said. "But belief is not the same as truth." He called expert witnesses in childhood memory, psychologists who explained how suggestion could implant images that felt real. One expert compared it to a photograph developed in the wrong chemicals, recognizable but distorted. He also pointed to the absence of physical evidence: no body, no blood, no weapon tied to a crime. "We have a story," Callahan said, "but not a single piece of tangible proof that Thomas Gibson was killed at all." He gestured toward Larry. "This man has been accused of the most terrible act imaginable, but ask yourselves, where is the evidence that it happened?" Larry himself did not testify. His attorney advised against it, saying his demeanor could be misread. The jurors never heard his voice except in recordings from his police interviews. In them, he sounded calm, almost detached. "I don't know what happened," he said repeatedly. "I came back and he was gone." Midway through the trial, the prosecution called Debbie Kallick, Larry's half-sister, to the stand. She wore a gray suit and looked directly at her brother as she testified. She recounted the late-night phone call she had received in 1991. "He sounded scared," she said. "He said, 'I think I killed him.'" Her voice trembled slightly but didn't waver. "I asked who. He said, 'Tommy.' He told me it was an accident, that he didn't mean to." Then he hung up. When asked why she hadn't come forward sooner, she lowered her eyes. "Because I didn't want to believe it," she said. "You tell yourself it was a dream, that you misunderstood. You don't want it to be true." The defense attacked her memory, too, pointing out that no phone records survived from that year, that stress can change how people recall words. But her testimony lingered. Next came Judith. She entered the courtroom quietly, her expression composed. On the stand, she described their life together, how Larry had been respected, disciplined, and devout. But she also spoke of the darker moments: his temper, his silences, the way he could turn cold in an instant. "He wasn't always violent," she said. "But when he was angry, it was like he wasn't there anymore." She described one night in Montana when he struck the wall beside her head. "He told me once," she said softly. "People think I'm the law, but they don't know me at home." The courtroom held its breath. As the trial entered its 5th week, the lines between memory and fact blurred. The jury listened to experts debate psychology, detectives retrace timelines, and lawyers argue the definition of intent, There were moments when the case seemed to collapse under its own contradictions. Then, in closing arguments, the prosecution returned to simplicity. "You've heard the stories, the theories, the doubt," Warner told the jury. "But look at what doesn't change. A healthy child vanished. His father's story never fit. His daughter remembered what she saw. His sister remembered what he confessed. You don't need to find the body to recognize the truth." The defense countered with precision. "We don't convict on feelings," Callahan said. "We convict on facts, and there are none here. If Thomas Gibson is gone, we don't know how or why or by whose hand. To punish a man on uncertainty is to abandon the very justice he once swore to uphold." The courtroom stayed silent as the jury filed out to deliberate. They were gone for 2 days. Judith didn't attend court during that time. She stayed home, waiting for the phone to ring. Larry remained still, staring at the wall, lips pressed into a thin line. On the 3rd day, the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. Everyone rose as the jurors filed in. The foreman held a folded piece of paper. The clerk took it and read aloud. "On the charge of murder in the 2nd degree, we find the defendant not guilty." A pause, then. "On the lesser charge of manslaughter in the 1st degree, we find the defendant guilty." The air shifted in the room. Larry exhaled once, eyes fixed forward. Judith closed her eyes, her face unreadable. The judge thanked the jury for their service and turned to sentencing. Under Oregon law, the range for 1st-degree manslaughter was 15 to 18 months. Because Larry had already served most of that time in custody during trial, the sentence amounted to little more than a formality. When the gavel came down, it sounded less like justice and more like an ending forced into words. Reporters rushed to file their stories. "Deputy convicted in son's death. Manslaughter, not murder." Neighbors offered quiet opinions. Some called it mercy, others failure. Outside the courthouse, Judith walked quickly to her car, head down. A reporter called after her. "Do you think justice was done?" She didn't answer. Larry was led away without handcuffs. His attorney whispered something in his ear, and he nodded once. That evening, the courthouse steps emptied, the cameras packed up, and the story that had begun in a small Oregon yard returned to the quiet it had always carried. Larry Gibson was released from the Oregon State Penitentiary in September 1996, a year and a half after the verdict. Technically, he had already served most of his sentence during the long months leading up to trial. When the prison gate opened that morning, there were no cameras waiting, no family reunion, no crowd to meet him. Only a single parole officer standing beside a government sedan. The officer handed him a folder containing his release papers, conditions of supervision, and an envelope with $47 in cash. Larry signed the last form, thanked the man, and walked out into the pale Oregon light. He was 43 years old and already looked older. His hair had thinned at the temples, and the rigid posture of a deputy had been replaced by something slower, more deliberate. When he stepped outside, he didn't turn back. He moved quietly at first, taking a small apartment in Montana under a shortened name, L.D. Gibson, and found work again as an insurance adjuster. His employer, a local firm, didn't ask many questions, and he didn't volunteer any answers. In the paperwork, the blank space for children remained unfilled. The parole reports from that period were uneventful. He checked in monthly, completed community service, kept his head down. "Polite, cooperative, emotionally flat," one officer wrote. But outside the forms, the world hadn't forgotten. The public was divided, sharply and irreparably. For some, the conviction had been a compromise they could live with. "It was an accident," one neighbor told a local newspaper. "A good man lost his temper and panicked. That doesn't make him evil." Others called it a miscarriage of justice. A father, a trained officer, had killed his child and walked free within a year. If his name wasn't Gibson, another said, he'd still be in a cell. Editorials debated it for months after his release. One headline read, "Deputy or criminal? Oregon still split on the Gibson case." Another framed it more bluntly, "When a badge becomes a shield." In Azalea, the house where it all began still stood at the end of the same gravel road. A new family lived there, a young couple with 2 kids who played in the same front yard. They told reporters they never felt haunted by the place. "We just don't talk about it," the husband said. "It's easier that way." Judith refused every interview request. She and the girls had long since moved to a small town outside Eugene, living under her maiden name. The local school listed Karen and Lisa under their stepfather's surname after Judith remarried briefly in 1998. When a reporter from Portland knocked on her door, she closed it softly and said, "That part of our lives is over." Her silence was absolute, but not empty. Larry, on the other hand, refused to disappear completely. In early 2001, using an outdated dial-up modem and a borrowed desktop computer, he created a simple website on a free hosting service. The title page read, "Searching for the Truth About Tommy." The site was primitive. White background, black text, no images. At the top was a statement. "My name is Larry Gibson. I am a father. My son disappeared in 1991 from our home in Azalea, Oregon. I was wrongfully accused and convicted of his death. I served my time, but I will not rest until the truth is found." He updated it irregularly, posting scanned copies of old documents, fragments of news articles, and his own commentary written in a detached, almost bureaucratic tone. The evidence was circumstantial, one entry read. There was no body, no cause of death, no motive. My daughter's memory was manipulated through therapy and suggestion. In another post, he wrote, "If Tommy is still alive, I pray that one day he will read this." Few people found the page, but those who did left polarized comments, some offering sympathy, others rage. "You're a liar," one message said simply. "You don't get to call it truth." Larry never replied. By 2003, the domain expired, and the site vanished from the internet. The Gibson case, however, refused to vanish with it. In the mid-1990s, the television series Unsolved Mysteries featured the story twice, framing it as one of the most perplexing missing child cases in Oregon history. The first episode aired in 1994, before the arrest, portraying Larry as a grieving father desperate for answers. The second aired in 1996, after his conviction, revisiting the same footage but with an entirely different tone, now as a cautionary tale about deception and trust. Robert Stack's narration, calm and grave, said, "How could a trained officer of the law lose his son within sight of his own front porch? And what really happened on that quiet morning in March 1991? Both broadcasts reignited public debate. Letters poured into the Douglas County Sheriff's Office and the Oregon State Police tip line. Some claimed to have seen a child matching Tommy's description years later. Others accused the department of covering up one of their own. None of the tips led anywhere. In 1993, before the trial, Tommy's face had also appeared in the now famous Runaway Train music video by Soul Asylum, a project that displayed missing children's photos on screen. He was the youngest child featured, his baby blue eyes blinking across MTV screens around the world. The line that accompanied his image read, "If you've seen this child, please call." By the time the video aired again in 1996, he was officially listed as deceased in court documents, though no remains had ever been found. The contradiction went unaddressed. Still, for a few seconds, his face lived again, frozen between lyrics about loss and escape, broadcast to millions. It was as close to immortality as a missing child could get. In Douglas County, the sheriff's office archived the case file that same year. The binders, marked Gibson, T.D., Missing Person, Open Unresolved, were boxed and stored in the evidence annex. Inside were maps of search grids, photographs of the yard, transcripts of interviews, and one final page stamped in red. Case status: closed. Exceptional clearance. The file still referred to the incident as a disappearance. Nowhere in the paperwork was the word murder written. A young detective who joined the department in 1999 found the box years later and leafed through the pages. He said later, "It felt like looking at something that wanted to keep its secrets." He closed the lid and put it back. As for the family, they lived in the long shadow of what couldn't be proven. Judith kept no photographs of Larry in the house. Karen, entering her teens, learned not to talk about her father when people asked. When classmates discovered the old news stories online, she claimed they were about someone else. Lisa, the youngest, knew her father only through a few newspaper clippings and her mother's silence. Once, in a rare interview decades later, Judith's sister said, "She forgave him in a way, but not like people think. Not forgiveness that frees you, just the kind that lets you sleep." In Montana, Larry aged quietly. He bought a small trailer outside Townsend, planted tomatoes, and kept to himself. He told people he was divorced, that his son had died young. He never mentioned the trial. Once a year, on March 18th, he left flowers near the edge of a creek outside town. When asked about it by a neighbor, he said, "For my boy. He's still out there somewhere." There were no cameras this time, no statements, no searches. Only a man and his reflection in the water. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone, somewhere, may still be waiting to be heard.